In this video, we're going to take a look at the 4 different racks in Ableton Live. We have the instrument rack, the audio effects rack, the MIDI effects rack, and the drum rack. These racks can be found under the relative headings. They all come with a range of different presets for various needs and tasks. If we open up a preset instrument rack, we can see that it also has a standard device activator button, title bar, hot swap button, and save preset button. It also has a macro map button, which we're going to come on to shortly. The buttons on the left-hand side of the rack split the rack up into foldable sections. We can show or hide the sections using these buttons, as well as completely collapsing the rack by double-clicking the rack title bar. The button with a macro knob on it shows or hides the macro controls. The chain button allows us to view the chains. The device button allows us to show or hide devices. We can also show or hide individual devices in the rack by clicking their title bar as normal. The macros can be thought of as a dashboard or a main display for many of the device's parameters within the rack. When you build your own rack, you can map these macro controls to whichever devices you want. You can also specify and invert their ranges. Many parameters can be mapped to the same macro knob, so you can control multiple functions from one knob. Live's rack presets will already have the macro controls mapped for you, which is indicated in the device's parameters by a green node to show you that it's been mapped to a macro control. Next we have the chains. Whereas putting effects one after the other in a rack can be thought of as placing them in serial or in line with each other, chains allow us to place instruments and effects in parallel or side by side with one another, so that one set of MIDI notes can trigger multiple affected and layered instruments to create unique timbres. We can duplicate chains using the Command and D shortcut, as well as by right-clicking and creating a new chain, or also by dragging an instrument into an empty chain slot. We can also rename different chains and select them by clicking the relevant chain title. Now we can move on to the devices section, which I'm sure you're familiar with. As you can see, we can drag these devices around the rack to change their order. We can add in new instruments or effects, as well as hot swap or delete the individual devices. Note that we can also drag devices out of the group or rack. This means they'll now affect all of the chains in the rack, rather than just that one specific chain. To build your own instrument rack, you can start by loading an instrument, and then add any relevant effects that you may want. Then, select all of the devices, right-click, and select Group to Instrument Rack. We can also achieve this by using the keyboard shortcut Command and G, or Group. This now gives us our instrument rack, with access to our macro controls, chains, and devices. To map the macro controls, we can press the Map button in the instrument rack, which opens Macro Map mode. We can now click a device parameter to select it, then click Map below the macro control. We can also do this by right-clicking a parameter in the rack and selecting Map to Macro 1. We can now further edit the controls by opening the browser window whilst in Macro Map mode. Next we have audio effects racks, which are similar to instrument racks but without the instrument. We can build them by either pulling in an audio effect rack from the browser to give us the audio effect rack's empty shell. Then we can drag in the effects, or we can build a rack by grouping effects like we did with the instrument rack. Next we have the MIDI effects rack. Once again, this is exactly the same as the previous racks, however it's for MIDI instead of audio or instruments. Finally we have the drum rack. This gives us 128 pads to put samples on, which we can navigate through using the pad selector on the left. Each of these pads has its own chain selector and a track output. This is grouped to the main drum rack in the mixer. We can then put devices on each individual sample slot, as well as set send and returns on the drum rack. Drum racks can also be grouped to instrument racks, as well as being able to place racks and sample slots within the drum rack. This can give us some very powerful control and versatile options for how we want to use the racks within Live.